Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Thomas Isler, leading North American partnerships at Finboot. It is a real pleasure to sponsor this important conversation alongside GTI Energy. Today, we are diving into one of the most urgent and complex challenges facing the energy sector: how to credibly measure, verify, and communicate emissions data across increasingly fragmented regulatory environments. At Finboot, we believe that digital traceability is not just a technical innovation, it is a critical enabler for trustworthy carbon accounting, which is why we find GTI's pioneering Veritas initiative so incredibly relevant, as we both are helping energy producers build the transparency and trust needed to meet decarbonization goals, unlock premium markets, and future-proof their business. Thank you for being here, and now I hand over to our facilitator and energy market expert, Geoffrey Cann, to kick off the discussion.
Thank you so much, Thomas, and welcome everyone for today's session, which we've entitled Credible Carbon, Verifying Emissions Data Across the Value Chain. I'm Geoffrey Cann. I'll be the moderator, but just by way of personal introduction, I'm an international author and a professional speaker on energy matters. And today we're going to be joined by Shannon Katcher, who is the Vice President of Digital Innovation at GTI Energy. GTI, in case you don't know, is a not-for-profit research organization that develops, proves, and scales low-carbon solutions. And also joining us is Juan Miguel Perez, who is the CEO and co-founder of Finboot. Juan is an engineer, holds a PhD in physics, and Finboot is a enterprise blockchain solution company that focuses on supply chain transparency, and in particular on hard-to-track products such as liquids and gases. So the energy world today is shifting. It's shifting very rapidly. Buyers, particularly those in hard-to-abate sectors like oil and gas, steelmaking, cement, aviation, heavy industry, they're no longer just asking about cost and reliability. They want hard data on carbon intensity. But we're in a world where the EU and North America's regulation sets are diverging, and measurement practices, unfortunately, are inconsistent, and delivering that data with credibility is actually far from simple. Put quite directly, carbon has a credibility problem, and that's why we're here today. This panel is going to bring together two important perspectives from GTI, the leader behind the Veritas initiative, which is working to build standardized science-based frameworks and useful for emissions management, and from Finboot, whose traceability technologies centered in the world of digital help make those measurements verifiable, transparent, and usable across supply chains. And what we'll hope to do is help producers and distributors navigate this evolving landscape and capture the commercial opportunities which are starting to emerge for provable low-carbon fuels. So let me welcome our Shannon and Juan to the session, and let me start with a first question. Why is this credible measurement-based carbon data, and this touches things like methane, not just methane, but CO2, hydrogen, and other gases, which are GHG challenges? Why is it becoming critical for fuel and gas producers, especially across EU and North American markets? And I think, Shannon, we'll start with you. Like, why is this an important initiative to undertake?
Yes, that's a great question. And one of the biggest factors in this is there's a lot of emerging regulation. There's a lot of decisions that are being made, and it's difficult to make those decisions without having credible foundations to begin with. So understanding what's going on in the first place in order to make these decisions and enforce these regulations is really critical and important. I would say currently, many organizations are doing more than ever to provide better measurements and have more direct measurements and really work with the data. But the issue is that we have inconsistent measurements. We have challenges being transparent about what we're doing. And so it's really a critical moment as we're trying to make different decisions and demonstrate the decarbonization efforts that many are making in the industry. You know, how do we do that, and how do we share this information?
And Shannon, is this inconsistency you speak of, is this a North American only, like between states or between Canada, the United States, Mexico, or is it more broad-based than that?
It's definitely more broad-based than that. Of course, at GTI Energy, we work for the most part in North America, but we do work a little bit internationally. I would say the issues come down to the different technologies that are available in different areas, and also the uncertainty in how we collect those measurements and share that information. So being able to break that down and share that in a consistent and credible way is really difficult. And there are several initiatives that are going on, including Veritas, to help do a better job at that. But as an overall industry, it's the time to come together and agree on some methodologies.
And Juan, you're based in Europe. What is the current European situation vis-a-vis credible measurement of carbon, and regardless of the gas form? Where's the state of the market in Europe?
I think basically, again, for producers, credibility is no longer optional, right? So gone are the days where a company would just make a statement about the products and buyers would simply accept those, right? So you mentioned the credibility issue or problem that energy products have. I think there's a broader issue in the energy industry, which is there's like an overall trust problem. Regardless of the reasons for that, you have now buyers of these low carbon products like airlines or tech firms who are willing to pay those product premiums, but they will only do so for verified low carbon products, right? So they're starting to demand that hard proof, that hard evidence, Geoffrey, that you mentioned earlier, which is something I think it's completely fair, right? Especially like we're looking at commoditized products where you're going to charge me more because you're claiming that your molecule is greener than the next one. If that's the case, well, you have to show it, right? And certainly, again, in Europe, you see regulatory frameworks that are pushing for more transparency, perhaps more aggressively than in North America. Things like CBAM in the EU, while now delayed, is certainly coming, and producers will definitely want to avoid those costs. And yes, there is certainly some divergence between EU and North America regulation, but without that credible data, producers in the US risk being locked out of the premium market that Europe is, right? Because Europe is still a huge market for US energy. As I prepare my remarks for today, I was checking at the numbers, and year to date, 77% of US LNG export shipments have come to Europe, right? So they can't afford to lose trust with these buyers who still have, either because they want to or have to, but still have firm Scope 2 and Scope 3 emission goals, right? So regardless of what US regulation says, I think that evidence-backed data verification is the only way in which you can satisfy the demands from your customers, from the buyers, so navigate that commercial opportunity and make sure you're ready for the regulatory landscape globally, essentially.
You've hinted at the commercial opportunity. Do you have any sense as to what the scale is of opportunity? I mean, it has to be significant, given that all organizations that are attempting to comply with carbon deregulation agendas, such as the Paris Climate Accord, are themselves fuel consumers. So it must be a very, very significant opportunity here.
So I think SAF is perhaps the area where you're seeing the most kind of commitment and demand for sustainable aviation fuel, right? And that's happening not just in Europe, like North America and US airlines are also demanding SAF. I know United and Delta both have very ambitious targets for SAF consumption. Don't know those off the top of my head, but the demand for sustainable aviation fuel is certainly growing. And you see that at least in European industrial manufacturing, the demand for lower carbon gas is growing as well. So because then that goes into the carbon footprint of their own products, and in their own products, they're being pushed to reduce that carbon footprint, right? So a very clear example is the automotive industry, who produces a lot of steel and aluminum components. They are being demanded by the OEMs to reduce the carbon footprint of their auto parts. And then how do they do that? Well, they need to decarbonize the raw material, the steel and the aluminum, but they also need to lower the carbon footprint of their energy consumption, right? They can do a lot with renewables, but ultimately gas and hydrogen play a key role in industrial manufacturing. They need a better low carbon options for those energy products as well.
Let's turn to the Veritas initiative, Shannon, because this is something that GTI has been driving to create this trusted foundation. What role does GTI play here?
That's a great question. So, if you look at traditional markets, you can measure the quality of the steel or the quality of the commodity at the point of sale. When we're talking about a market for low carbon gases and fuels, that's not something you can necessarily just simply measure at the point of sale. So what we're talking about is creating an opportunity for more empirical measurements across the entire value chain along the way, and having that collaboration and people agreeing from production all the way to end use on how we collect that information and how we make that information transparent along that supply chain. So where Veritas comes into this is creating a consistent methodology and some protocols on how much do we have to measure to get a good estimate. At what points do we need to think about how we measure things, and trying to keep an open opportunity for all different technologies, because I think we all know here, and probably everyone listening to this webinar, there's not one single technology that can be deployed to do this along the way. You have to necessarily use many different technologies in order to do this, and it varies across the supply chain as well. So getting some information and protocols and standards on how we're measuring that information and how we're calculating the uncertainty that goes along with that, and coming out with information that can be used in a credible marketplace for the things that Juan is talking about, to be able to demonstrate that we're really doing what we're saying we're doing and having the data to prove it.
It implies, though, that today we are principally estimating carbon as opposed to empirically measuring it. And then secondarily, those measurements don't travel along with the carbon intense product through the value chain. Therefore, at the very end, all you can do is make a wild guess, really, as to how much carbon is involved in a product. Is that the way to characterize this?
Yes, and obviously people have been making different initiatives that try to support creating better estimates along the way, and certain organizations have been collecting measurements for quite some time, right? That they've made tons of progress and have lots of experts in their organization that know how to do this. But when it comes down to it, it's not consistent, and it is in many ways a guess. And even though we have things like in the US, we have the greenhouse gas emissions reporting protocols. We use emission factors today to kind of estimate. Those are based on a lot of research and study that has gone into creating those emission factors. But when it comes down to it, they're estimates at the end. And that doesn't really demonstrate what's actually going on out in the field.
Now, you did mention that there's a whole range of technologies actually that have to play a role here in order to overcome this measurement and tracking and tracing. Can you give some ideas to the kinds of technologies we're talking about here?
Absolutely. So there are, continuous monitoring technologies that monitor site level emissions that, you can deploy. Many organizations have a challenge because consider you have thousands of wells, and that means deploying thousands of these technologies across your sites, which some people are thinking about ways to do that. But you have these continuous monitoring devices that operate on a site level scale, and then you have drones and aircraft that are flying over different territories, and you have satellites that are flying over entire basins at a time. And if you can imagine the data that's collected and the granularity and the different levels of emissions that each of those technology are capable of measuring, that's really hard to reconcile at the end of the day. And so being able to do that a little bit better and figure out ways to reconcile all of that data collection and be able to store that and track it along the way, it's a very big challenge. It's not easy. But there's tons of progress being made, and I'm very hopeful and optimistic about how we're going to be able to do this going forward.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that the technologies we need to do this aren't imaginary. They're all real, and much of it has been deployed in one sector or another for one purpose or another. We just have yet to apply it in this case here. But it still raises this basic question, which is, I can measure it, but how do I trace it all the way through the supply chain to the very end? So I then have a provable carbon intensity indication that I can then supply to my products. And I think this is where traceability becomes really key. Juan, maybe I could just ask you, how does digital traceability, say from in the blockchain context and in Finboot's case, how do you operationalize and then scale this using these new technologies?
Yeah, I think, and the point that Shannon was making is precisely where we come, right? So we come in place, and digital traceability platforms in general come in place as almost as an exoskeleton that then connects to all of these data flows across the industrial manufacturing ecosystem, right? So again, solutions like Finboot's Marco, they ensure that emission data is then tamper-proof, that is transparent, that is auditable across that entire value chain. And we are already tracing that entire process, right? So we trace production, we trace distribution, and in some occasions we even trace consumption of these energy products, collecting all of these key metrics along the way. Again, today it's a bit hybrid. Some of it comes from monitoring technologies like the ones Shannon was mentioning. Some of it comes from manual entry or legacy systems, but you already have a capacity to start building that thread of information. And this already has a proven return and a proven value for energy players, right? And I have an interesting example to share today, which is a recent project we did with Repsol and Navantia. So Repsol, as many of you know, is a global multi-energy provider, and Navantia is a multinational shipbuilder company serving both civil and military sectors, right? And in this project, we wanted to see what happened when you digitally trace the full cycle. In this case, it was a maritime sustainable fuel, and trace that from production to distribution to the consumption, and start collecting more kind of accurate data at each step, as opposed to this estimated information. Apologies. So this allowed us to create three comparison points, right? So you had the first one where we had 100% traditional fossil fuel. You compare that to that kind of emission-based generic estimate calculation of a low carbon fuel. And then you had the emissions calculated using that fully traced batch specific low carbon fuel data that we were collecting in the process, right? So when you compare the emission reductions between the estimated and the batch specific low carbon, we found that fully traced fuel can enable us to demonstrate greater reductions on emissions compared to using estimates, right? So again, for a particular batch that we traced, the data showed a 28% emission savings in the fully traced fuel compared to 20% when we use generic estimates. So those results will vary by blend, because ultimately these are batches that are being transported and are blended with fossil naphtha. But that 8% gap is very significant when you look at the total volumes of fuel, right?
Yeah. So
again, there's a benefit there. To execute this at scale, you need a digital solution in place, because if you don't have digital records, and this process, if carried out manually, will become a huge burden. The overheads in resource allocation will start impacting the returns that you can get. And even the best manual process loses credibility across a complex value chain, right? So that's, again, where these digital traceability platforms will give the producer the confidence to back up the claims that they're putting out there. And it gives the buyers the confidence to say, yeah, I'm gonna pay for the premium because I see that there's evidence-backed data behind this.
It's a big improvement between empirical measurement and estimation. I had a guest on my podcast recently who was tracking empirical gas through natural gas at wellhead all the way through to liquefied natural gas sold into Europe, and they were finding an even bigger gap than that, closer to 40%. Which, and if you're a trader, these are huge numbers. These are real tradable, bankable value proposition. So this brings us to the challenge here, of course, is if there's the prize. This prize is large, it's accessible, technology exists. people are working hard to develop the frameworks and so on. Shannon, maybe I could turn to you. What do you see? I mean, in the Veritas initiative, what are some of the challenges producers are putting forward to that really impede the implementation of improvements here?
Well, actually, Juan touched on one of the biggest things, which is scalability. Just getting these practices to scalable solutions is really difficult. It's a challenge for everybody in most things that we all do at our organizations, but this one in particular, because it does require a lot of collaboration and a lot of consistent thinking. We've even seen that, even with consistent guidelines, there could be different interpretations of those guidelines. So there's a real need for tools and digital products to help support the scalability of these things, because we don't want to have to hire 10 PhD data scientists to be able to do these calculations and to demonstrate progress, right? We want to make it easy and really feasible to be able to execute these things that are ahead of us. And obviously, regulatory support of those things is going to become super critical. We're already starting to see some of that come through. And obviously the EU is sort of leading in that territory. So we'll see what happens in the US. There's a little bit more fluctuation in the US right now, but there's an exciting number of years. I think that the organizations that have invested heavily in just doing a better job with measurements and doing a better job with identifying that there is actually a value to these low carbon commodities, they're not going to stop investing in these things. And so we have to make sure that we can make these solutions scalable and realistic for organizations to deploy. That's probably one of the biggest challenges.
And Juan, my sense is that Repsol doing the sort of early stage verification, validation of the data provides them with a sense of the ability to get ahead of the market here. Is there an opportunity for the early adopters to pursue here, or is this really about a homogeneous market moving in lockstep?
I 100% think there's an opportunity for early movers, and they will reap the biggest benefits, right? I think the barriers that we see, or the challenges that we see for them to kind of start acting, there's certainly some of that regulatory fragmentation that I'll get to in a minute. But the biggest barrier is those siloed legacy systems, right? And the perceived cost of implementing or integrating a new solution. And I say perceived because that's often a very big misconception, right? So a lot of the blame here, I'm going to be more, let's say, outspoken than I typically am, but a lot of the blame here is with those outdated legacy systems, right? So these platforms that haven't kept pace with modern digital needs, and that every minor change that is required then triggers a long and expensive and complex and burden of a project that will take months, or if not, it takes years to implement, right? So this has created kind of that false perception that all digital innovation in industrial ecosystems or at an enterprise level is low and is costly, right? And that's the biggest frustration for us, because again, digital technologies today should be more agile. They should be inherently flexible, which is what we've done at Finboot and how we've built Finboot. And us tech vendors have to do a better job at simplifying and delivering that real-time value, right? And I think that approach is already working. I had a recent conversation with the leader of low carbon product development at another one of our major customers. Again, they're dealing now with flowing low carbon naphtha and how that kind of transforms into the final products. They already use our solution in a different area. And now they're saying, look, as much as possible of this, we want to manage through Marco, Finboot's platform, because we want to minimize any changes or any rework to our systems, right? Because they already know, again, how difficult that can be. And they also know firsthand experience that there's actually alternatives to that, right? So again, you take all of this into consideration, and coming back to your point on early movers, Geoffrey, I think the real risk then is being that late mover, right? Because I think we need those early adopters that are doing industrial pilots, that are integrating digital traceabilities, that are collaborating with the likes of GTI to bring these frameworks like Veritas into place. And those players that are acting now are the ones that are going to be better positioned to differentiate their products and then to demand those premium pricings or to gain those premium pricings from the market.
I'd say in defense of the industry and its systems that it's worthy to remember that 60% of oil companies only started to use cloud computing, as an example, during the pandemic, because the situation forced them to do so. So these legacy systems do create a significant challenge and barrier because of their maturity, their age, and their lack of flexibility. Let's conclude with one final question around what's coming up next. Like, what do you see coming in terms of market signals, regulatory changes, buyer demands that might give shape to this space? And Juan, maybe I'll just ask you that question from the European perspective. What's changing out there that you see on the horizon here?
Yeah, and I think it lets me touch on the regulation, which I missed just before, but there's a clear shift, right? And the shift is towards real-time verifiable carbon reporting. And I don't think that's only driven by regulators. I think there's also demands by buyers, because they themselves are being pressured to have that real-time carbon reporting in a way. And so the trend is moving away from those traditional static annual sustainability reports towards a more continuous real-time data gathering and validation, right? So in the regulatory front, again, we see divergence today. I still believe, / maybe I'm hopeful that long-term we'll see convergence between EU and North American regulations. That's not going to happen quickly. That is definitely not going to happen within the next 4 years. And companies can't afford to wait to have that full alignment and everything's ready and everything is kind of easy now because everyone has agreed. So I think they need to act now, navigating the complexities of geopolitical tensions, let's say, but they need to start to take actions now, right? And I think, and of course there's a bit of a bias here, but I think we're going to start seeing the rise of digital traceability platforms, and these platforms that can essentially offer that verified product credentials, product sustainability, and emissions-related credentials, where you can then position these products in marketplaces that may still be partly physical, partly digital, but are very well interconnected with digital traceability and that provide that credible verification, right? So that's exactly what kind of excites me, right? So the platforms like ours, I think, are positioning themselves to build that connecting tissue for this future where transparency and trust are the priorities, let's say, for both the energy and broader sustainability ecosystems.
Shannon, let me turn that same question over to you from the perspective of Veritas Initiative and GTI in particular. What do you see coming in terms of market signals, regulatory changes or expectations, even buyer demands in North America that will help frame this entire carbon credibility question?
Yes, I think the demand is there. I think we're already seeing that. And also organizations have invested heavily in this topic and demonstrating their low carbon commodities. So I don't see that changing. I think that that's going to continue. It may not be driven by the exact regulatory frameworks at first. It may be driven by more financial motivations that help give credibility in the marketplace for low carbon fuels. And I say that across a variety of fuels, it's including hydrogen as well. So I really see that, there's been such great movement already in the past and such great investment. I don't think that that's going to slow down too much. Every indication that we're getting is, how do we keep doing this? How do we do it faster? And to Juan's point, how do we make this easier through tools and technologies to support this complex data and systems and reduce the complexity so that we can actually make meaningful changes?
Well, I'm personally very delighted to hear that carbon's credibility issue is on the table, and we're working hard to resolve it. Shannon and Juan, thank you very much for joining me for this conversation today, and I'll turn it back now to Thomas.
Thank you very much, Geoffrey, Shannon, Juan, for very insightful and thought-provoking discussions. And thank you, everyone watching, for taking the time to be part of this conversation. Really appreciate it. At Finboot, we are committed to helping the energy industry move from ambition to action through credible, traceable, and verifiable emission data. If today's session resonated with you, we invite you to learn more about how digital traceability and collaborative frameworks like Veritas can help you lead in this rapidly evolving market. Be sure to reach out to our team for additional information on these and other digital traceability and green supply chain needs in the energy space. Thanks again, and we look forward to continuing the conversation.